That baby was on the train tracks about to meet her end, but a millionaire dives in to save her. But just when they thought everything was going to be all right, this happens. Comment and subscribe to the channel to support my work. The train sped along the tracks, cutting through the landscape of the small town of Harmony Creek. The metallic sound echoed through the practically empty station on that September afternoon. Ezekiel Marquette watched the activity from the window of his makeshift office, temporarily set up in a commercial building near the station. At 47, his face bore the marks of a life dedicated to work and solitude. His blue eyes, once vibrant, now seemed dull and distant. The business meetings in this upstate town were just another stop on his exhausting routine. While organizing some documents on the table, an unusual movement caught his attention through the window. A hooded figure moved furtively along the platform. Something about their movement seemed wrong, desperate. Ezekiel frowned, a primal instinct alerting him that something was about to happen. The figure stopped near the tracks, looked around, and in a quick movement placed a small bundle on the ground. Ezekiel's heart raced when he realized the bundle was moving. Without thinking twice, he dropped the papers on the table and ran out of the office. His footsteps echoed down the emergency staircase as he descended the 4 floors of the building. Time seemed to slow down. When he reached the platform, the hooded figure had already disappeared. Ezekiel ran towards the tracks, his body driven by an urgency he couldn't explain. It was then he heard it, a faint cry, almost imperceptible amid the noise of the station. His blood ran cold. There, between the metal rails, was a baby wrapped in a dirty blanket. The child couldn't have been more than a few days old. Her small hands flailed in the air in a silent plea for help. The distant whistle of a train cut through the air. Ezekiel looked to the right and saw the lights approaching rapidly. Without hesitation, he jumped onto the tracks. The gravel ground hurt his knees as he crawled towards the baby. His hands trembled as he tried to reach the small bundle. The noise of the train grew louder with each second. Ezekiel could feel the vibration of the tracks increasing. Finally, he managed to grab the blanket, but as he tried to get up, his foot slipped. The baby slipped from his grasp, rolling a few inches away. Despair washed over him. The train was too close. In a last-ditch effort, Ezekiel threw himself towards the child, managing to grab her. With a desperate push, he rolled to the side, falling violently onto the ballast beside the tracks. The train passed like thunder just inches from where they were. The wind caused by the passage of the train whipped their bodies. Ezekiel held the baby close to his chest, feeling her little heartbeat rapidly against his own. When the train finally passed, Ezekiel allowed himself to breathe. His hands trembled as he pulled the blanket away from the baby's face. It was a girl. Her little face was red from crying, but her eyes, large and dark, stared at him with an intensity that made him shiver. Station workers began to approach, alerted by the commotion. Ezekiel barely heard them. He was focused on the small being in his arms, examining every inch of her fragile body for injuries. It was then that he noticed the marks, small bruises and scratches scattered across the child's arms. His stomach churned when he realized those weren't accidental marks. Someone had hurt this baby deliberately. An ambulance was called. While they waited, Ezekiel couldn't take his eyes off the girl. There was something in those eyes, something that reminded him of a pain he had long tried to forget. The little one gripped his finger tightly, as if she knew he was her only chance of survival. The paramedic tried to take the child from his arms, but Ezekiel resisted. "I'm going with her," he said with a voice that brooked no argument. On the way to the hospital, as the siren cut through the silence of the town, he made a silent promise. To that little survivor, she would never be abandoned again. In the emergency room, the doctors examined the girl urgently. Dr. Richards, a grey-haired man with a serious expression, conducted the initial examinations. Each new discovery seemed to add more weight to the doctor's face. "She's dehydrated," Dr. Richards explained, adjusting his glasses. "There are signs of severe neglect. From the bruises, I can tell she's been abused. It's a miracle she survived." Ezekiel listened in silence, his jaw tight with tension. How could anyone do this to such a small child? The doctor continued listing the problems he found, but his voice seemed distant. Ezekiel could only think about the fragility of that life that fate had placed in his path. "We'll need to admit her for observation," the doctor concluded. "Child Protective Services has already been notified. They'll need to investigate the case." Ezekiel nodded mechanically, but something inside him had already changed. As he watched the little one being taken to the neonatal ICU, he knew that his life would never be the same. That child, abandoned on the tracks as if she were worthless, had awakened in him feelings he thought were long dead. Night fell on the hospital, but Ezekiel didn't leave the waiting room. His work appointments were forgotten. Nothing else mattered, besides that little survivor fighting for her life a few floors above. The hours dragged on in the hospital like an eternity. Ezekiel remained seated in the same uncomfortable chair in the waiting room, his aching back protesting against the immobility. His clothes, still dirty from the ballast of the tracks, bore the physical marks of that afternoon that had changed his life. The cold coffee in his hands no longer had any effect. His eyes burned with fatigue, but he refused to leave the hospital. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the frightened little face of that small child, her large eyes pleading for help. How could he leave without knowing if she was okay? Around 3 in the morning, Dr. Richards appeared again. His features showed the weariness of a difficult shift, but there was something more in his expression, a worry that made Ezekiel's stomach clench. "Mr. Marquette," the doctor began, sitting down beside him, "the tests showed some complications. The baby has severe pneumonia, probably caused by exposure to the cold and the precarious conditions in which she was kept." Ezekiel felt the air leave his lungs. "But she's going to be okay, isn't she?" The doctor adjusted his glasses, a gesture that seemed more as a way to buy time than a genuine necessity. "We're doing everything we can. She's very small, and her immune system is compromised. The next 48 hours will be crucial." The silence that followed weighed like lead. Ezekiel ran his hands over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. "Can I see her?" Dr. Richards hesitated for a moment. "We don't usually allow visitors in the neonatal ICU at this hour, but come with me." They walked through silent corridors until they reached the neonatal ICU. Through the glass, Ezekiel saw the little creature in an incubator, surrounded by machines and tubes. Her tiny body seemed even smaller amidst all the medical equipment. "We need to register her with a name," the doctor said softly, "for the hospital records." Ezekiel watched the girl for a long moment. "Mirella," he said finally. "Her name is Mirella." The name had surfaced in his mind like a distant memory. It was the name his late wife, Maria Helena, always said she would give a daughter if they had had the chance. The pain of that memory, which he had kept locked away for so long, hit him like a wave. Maria Helena had died 15 years ago during a robbery. She was 6 months pregnant. Since then, Ezekiel had closed himself off from the world, immersing himself in work as a form of escape. Now, looking at that little survivor, something within him was beginning to awaken. The next few hours were a blur of conversations with social workers and police officers. The story of the baby abandoned on the tracks had spread quickly through the small town. Everyone wanted to know details. Everyone had questions, theories, opinions. Ezekiel answered mechanically, his mind always returning to the neonatal ICU. Between conversations, he escaped to observe Mirella through the glass. Each breath she took seemed like a small victory, each movement of her little fingers a miracle. In the late afternoon of the following day, a social worker named Regina brought disturbing news. "We found records of a woman who was admitted to the county hospital 3 days ago in labor," she explained, consulting her notes. "She fled a few hours after giving birth, leaving the baby behind. The hospital was preparing the documentation to notify the authorities when the child also disappeared." Ezekiel felt his blood boil. "So someone took her from the hospital?" Regina nodded gravely. "We have reason to believe so. The description of the child matches. We're investigating the hospital staff, but..." She hesitated. "There are indications that the mother was involved with dangerous people. There may be more to this story than we imagined." The news hit Ezekiel like a ton of bricks. What kind of people would be capable of stealing a newborn from a hospital, hurting her, and then abandoning her to die? The idea made his stomach churn. That night, as he watched Mirella fight for her life in the incubator, Ezekiel made a decision that would change his destiny forever. No matter what happened, he wouldn't allow that child to return to an environment of violence and neglect. The next morning, he sought out Regina. "I want to file for temporary guardianship," he announced, his voice firm despite his fatigue. The social worker looked at him in surprise. "Mr. Marquette, I need to warn you that this is a complex process. You're single, you have a busy professional life." "I don't care," he interrupted. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll move here if I have to. I can work remotely, I have resources, but I won't abandon her." Regina studied him for a long moment, as if assessing his determination. "Do you understand that if the biological mother appears, she has legal priority?" Ezekiel felt a chill run down his spine. After what they did to her, that woman abandoned her daughter to die. What kind of mother would do that? Before Regina could answer, an alarm sounded in the neonatal ICU. Ezekiel saw doctors and nurses rushing to Mirella's incubator. His heart stopped. Through the glass, he watched the medical team work frantically. The numbers on the monitors flashed red. Dr. Richards gave rapid orders, his hands moving with precision over the baby's tiny body. Ezekiel pressed his hands against the glass, feeling completely helpless. He couldn't lose her. Not now, not like this. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Finally, the monitors returned to normal. Dr. Richards came out of the ICU, his face marked by the tension of the moment. "She had a respiratory arrest," he explained, removing his surgical mask. "We managed to stabilize her, but..." He paused, choosing his words. "The pneumonia is worsening. We need to change the medication, try a more aggressive approach." Ezekiel nodded mechanically, still trying to process what had happened. "Do whatever it takes," he said, his voice hoarse. "Anything. Cost is no object." The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Marquette, you need to prepare yourself. Even with all the treatment, I can't guarantee..." "She will survive," Ezekiel interrupted, his voice filled with a certainty he didn't feel. "She has to survive." That night, for the first time in 15 years, Ezekiel Marquette cried. Sitting alone in the hospital chapel, he let all the emotions he had suppressed for so long finally surface. He cried for Maria Helena, for the child he never knew, and now for Mirella, that little soul who, in less than 48 hours, had demolished all the barriers he had built around his heart. The days that followed at the hospital were a blur of tests, medications, and agonizing waiting. Ezekiel established a strict routine. He spent the mornings on his laptop, managing his company remotely from a small room the hospital had provided due to the special circumstances. The afternoons and evenings were dedicated entirely to Mirella. The little one fought bravely against the pneumonia. Her tiny body reacted to the antibiotics with a strength that surprised even the most experienced doctors. Slowly, very slowly, she began to show signs of improvement. Ezekiel watched each small progress as a personal victory. The first day she managed to breathe without the help of the machine for a few hours. The first time her eyes focused directly on him through the glass of the incubator. The moment her little fingers closed tightly around his finger during one of the rare moments when he could touch her. It was during one of these visits that Dr. Richards brought the first good news in days. "The fever has completely subsided," he announced, consulting the chart. "The tests show that the infection is responding well to the treatment. If it continues like this, in a few days we can take her out of the incubator." The news was like a ray of sunshine after a never-ending storm. Ezekiel felt his eyes well up, but he maintained his composure. Years in the corporate world had taught him to control his emotions in public, but inside his heart sang. Regina, the social worker, was also present during the consultation. Her face, however, remained serious. "Mr. Marquette," she began after the doctor left, "we need to talk about Mirella's legal situation." Ezekiel felt his stomach sink. In recent days, he had focused so much on the baby's recovery that he had almost forgotten about the bureaucratic aspects of the situation. "The police haven't been able to locate the biological mother," Regina continued, "but that doesn't mean she can't show up eventually. You need to understand that any guardianship you get now will be temporary." "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice firm. "Tell me the procedures, and I'll follow them all." Regina sighed, pulling a file from her bag. "You have an established life in New York City, a company to run. You can't just—" "Yes, I can," he interrupted. "I've already talked to my team. I can manage everything remotely. I've already rented a house nearby, too. It's being furnished right now." Regina raised her eyebrows, surprised by his determination. "You've really thought of everything. When it comes to Mirella, there's no other option." In the days that followed, Ezekiel divided his time between the hospital and organizing his new life. The house he had rented, a single-story building in a quiet neighborhood, was completely adapted to receive a baby. He hired an experienced nurse, Teresa, recommended by Dr. Richards himself, to help him when Mirella was discharged. But not all the news was good. One particularly cold morning, Regina appeared at the hospital with a worried expression. "We received a report," she said after asking to speak in private. "Someone saw a suspicious woman loitering around the hospital in recent days." Ezekiel felt his entire body stiffen. "Do you think it could be—" "We don't know," Regina interrupted. "But the description matches the biological mother. Security cameras recorded someone watching the pediatric ward from a distance. The person always wears a hood, just like the day when—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The news disturbed him deeply. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stayed watching Mirella through the glass of the neonatal ICU, his heart tight with worry. The little one slept serenely, oblivious to all the tension around her. The next morning, a nurse found something concerning. An anonymous note had been left at the hospital reception. "She's mine. I'm going to take her back," the message read, written in a shaky hand. Hospital security was immediately reinforced. Ezekiel hired 2 private security guards to stand watch 24 hours a day in the pediatric ward. But the feeling of threat remained, like a dark shadow looming over them. It was in this climate of tension that Mirella was finally discharged from the neonatal ICU. After nearly 3 weeks of hospitalization, she was strong enough to breathe on her own and feed normally. Her weight was still below ideal, but the doctors were optimistic about her recovery. The moment of holding her in his arms for the first time, without the barrier of the incubator, was indescribable. Ezekiel trembled slightly as the nurse placed the small bundle in his arms. Mirella opened her eyes, those same large, expressive eyes that had captivated him from the first moment, and let out a small yawn. "Hi, little one," he whispered, his voice choked up. "I promise I'll protect you, always." But fate had other plans. On the night before the hospital discharge, Ezekiel was surprised by a call from Regina. Her voice was tense, worried. "Mr. Marquette, something happened that you need to know," she said hesitantly. "A woman was admitted to the emergency room. A few hours ago, she's very badly hurt. It looks like she was assaulted. Before losing consciousness, she said she's Mirella's mother." Ezekiel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His first instinct was to run to the room where Mirella was, now in the pediatric section. The baby slept peacefully, protected by the guards at the door. "She's under police protection," Regina continued, "but as soon as she recovers, she'll want to see her daughter, and legally." "She abandoned the child to die," Ezekiel interrupted, his voice trembling with anger. "What kind of mother would do that?" "There's more to this story, Mr. Marquette," Regina replied softly. "The woman is very scared. She says she was forced to abandon the baby, that she was being threatened." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with implications. Ezekiel looked at Mirella through the window of the room, his heart torn between anger at the biological mother and fear of losing the child he already considered his daughter. "What's going to happen now?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Now nothing changes," Regina replied. "Temporary guardianship has already been granted to you, but we need to investigate this woman's story. If she's telling the truth, if she really was coerced." Ezekiel couldn't sleep that night. He sat next to Mirella's crib, watching every breath, every small movement. Regina's words echoed in his mind, along with a growing fear. He couldn't lose Mirella. Not after everything they had been through together. Not after finally finding a reason to live again. But fate once again was preparing a twist that no one could foresee. The next morning, when the nurse came in for the first checkup of the day, she found something disturbing. Mirella had a high fever. Her little body, which seemed finally recovered, was shaking with chills. Dr. Richards was called urgently. His eyes narrowed as he examined the baby. "Something's wrong," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "This isn't a normal relapse of pneumonia." New tests were ordered urgently. As they waited for the results, Ezekiel felt his world crumble. Once again, what was happening to his little warrior? Why, just when everything seemed to be on track, was fate playing them another cruel trick? The answer would come in the next few hours, and it would be more devastating than anyone could imagine. The results of Mirella's tests arrived late that afternoon. Dr. Richards called Ezekiel to his office, and one look at his face was enough to know that the news wasn't good. The doctor was sitting behind his desk, a thick file open in front of him, his restless hands adjusting his glasses repeatedly, a nervous tic that Ezekiel had already learned to recognize as a sign of concern. "Mr. Marquette," he began, his voice controlled but tense. "The tests showed something that worries us a lot. Mirella's fever isn't caused by a relapse of pneumonia, as we initially suspected. We found some changes in her blood that indicate the possibility of a more serious condition." Ezekiel felt his heart clench. "What kind of condition?" The doctor picked up some test sheets, pointing to graphs and numbers that made no sense to Ezekiel. "Her blood markers are very altered. There are indications of a severe metabolic dysfunction. We need to do more tests, but—" He paused, choosing his words. "We suspect a rare genetic condition." The room seemed to spin for a moment. Ezekiel leaned on the table, trying to maintain his composure. "And what's the treatment?" Dr. Richards removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. That's where things get complicated. If it's what we suspect, there is a treatment, but... He hesitated again. The necessary medication isn't available in the US. It's an experimental medication, approved only in a few countries. Ezekiel felt a surge of determination grow within him. Money is no object. We can import it, get a special authorization. It's not that simple, the doctor interrupted. There are complex bureaucratic issues. The medication is at the center of a dispute between pharmaceutical companies. Importation is blocked by political and commercial issues. At that moment, a nurse rushed into the room. Dr. Richards, Mirella's fever has risen even higher. It's at 103.1 degrees and isn't responding to antipyretics. The two men rushed to the room. Mirella was in the crib, her little face red with fever, her little body restless. Teresa, the nurse hired by Ezekiel, applied cold compresses to her forehead, trying to lower her temperature. We need to take her back to the ICU again, Dr. Richards decided, already calling the team. We'll need stronger medication to control this fever. The next few hours were a nightmare. Ezekiel watched helplessly as the medical team struggled to stabilize Mirella. The monitors beeped constantly, marking every fluctuation in her vital signs. The fever finally subsided in the early morning hours, but it left the little one completely exhausted. It was during this agonizing night that Regina appeared at the hospital, her face etched with worry. Mr. Marquette, we need to talk, she said, pulling him to a more private corner of the hallway. It's about Mirella's mother. Ezekiel felt his body stiffen. With all the worry about Mirella's health, he had almost forgotten about this other problem. What about her? She woke up, Regina explained. And she's saying things disturbing and things. She says Mirella may be in danger, that there are people looking for her, dangerous people. What kind of people? Regina lowered her voice even further. She didn't want to give details, she's very scared, but she mentioned something. About debts, about being forced to participate in a criminal scheme when she was pregnant, and she hesitated. She said she has important information about Mirella's health. Ezekiel felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? She wants to talk to you personally, only to you. The idea of meeting the woman who had abandoned Mirella on the tracks made his blood boil. But if she had information about the baby's health, where is she? In room 304, Regina replied. There's a police officer at the door. She's in custody. She can't leave the hospital. Ezekiel looked once more towards the ICU where Mirella slept, before following Regina down the corridors. His heart beat faster, a mixture of anger and apprehension, growing with each step. Room 304 was at the end of the hallway. A young police officer guarded the door, checking identifications before allowing entry. Inside, lying on the hospital bed, was a woman who Ezekiel estimated to be around 30 years old. Her face was marked by recent bruises, one of her eyes still swollen. Despite the injuries, there was something in her features that reminded Ezekiel of Mirella, the same large, dark eyes. You must be the man who saved my daughter, she said, her voice hoarse and low. My name is Darlene. Ezekiel remained silent, his fists clenched at his sides. The anger he felt was almost palpable. I know you must hate me, she continued. You have every right to. What I did, there's no justification. But you need to listen to me. Mirella is in danger. The only danger she was in was when you abandoned her to die, Ezekiel replied, his voice trembling with contained rage. Darlene closed her eyes, tears streaming down her bruised face. You don't understand. I didn't have a choice. They forced me. And now, if they find out she's alive... Who are they? Dangerous people, she whispered. I owed money. A lot of money. When they found out I was pregnant, her voice faltered. They have doctors working for them. They did things, experiments. Ezekiel felt his stomach churn. What kind of experiments? Darlene looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. Experimental drugs. They said it was for research, that it wouldn't harm the baby. But I know it wasn't true. And now Mirella is sick, isn't she? With strange symptoms. The floor seemed to disappear beneath Ezekiel's feet. Dr. Richards's words about rare genetic conditions echoed in his mind. What do you know about her illness? She wasn't supposed to survive, Darlene whispered, more tears streaming down her face. Their plan was to use the pregnancy to test the drugs and then... She didn't complete the sentence, but she didn't need to. Ezekiel felt a wave of nausea. Why are you telling me this now? Because they found out she's alive. That's why they attacked me. Darlene pointed to her injuries. They wanted to know where she was. I didn't tell them, I swear I didn't. But they'll find out. And when they find out... An alarm sounded in the ICU, interrupting the conversation. Ezekiel recognized it immediately. It was coming from the direction of Mirella's room. Without waiting for more explanations, he ran down the corridor, his heart threatening to explode in his chest. Arriving at the ICU, he found the medical team in turmoil. Mirella was having another crisis, her temperature rising rapidly, her little body convulsing in the crib. The fever is back, Teresa informed him, her voice urgent, and it's worse than before. Dr. Richards administered medications, giving rapid orders to the team. But there was something different in his eyes now, a fear that Ezekiel had never seen before. At that moment, watching his little warrior fight for her life once again, Ezekiel knew that the battle was just beginning, and it would be much more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The night turned into an endless nightmare. The doctors fought to control Mirella's seizures while her vital signs fluctuated dangerously. Ezekiel watched everything through the glass of the ICU, his hands pressed against the cold surface as if he could reach her with the force of his will alone. Dr. Richards didn't leave the crib's side, adjusting medications, consulting monitors, giving precise orders to the team. His face was etched with worry and something else, a kind of professional bewilderment that made Ezekiel tremble inside. "This isn't normal," the doctor muttered at one point, more to himself than to the others. "The way she's reacting to the medications, it's as if her body is programmed to reject them." Darlene's words echoed in Ezekiel's mind. Experimental drugs. They said it was for research. He felt his stomach churn. What had they done to his little one even before she was born? Around 3 in the morning, Teresa approached him with a cup of coffee. The nurse seemed as exhausted as everyone else, but she stood firm at her post. "You need to rest a little," she said gently. "You won't help Mirella if you get sick too." Ezekiel accepted the coffee, but he didn't move. "I can't leave her, Teresa. What if..." His voice faltered, unable to complete the thought. Teresa placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture of comfort that almost broke his composure. "She's strong," the nurse said. "Stronger than we imagine. She's already overcome so much." A movement in the hallway caught their attention. Regina was hurrying towards them, carrying a file and with a serious expression on her face. "Mr. Marquette," she called, lowering her voice, "we need to talk. It's about what Darlene told me after you left." Ezekiel looked once more at Mirella before following Regina to an empty room nearby. His already heavy heart seemed to sink even further in his chest. "Darlene started talking," Regina explained, consulting her notes. "She's scared, very scared, but she wants to help. She says she knows the medication Mirella needs." Ezekiel felt a spark of hope. "How so?" "Apparently it's the same medication they used in the experiments." Regina hesitated on the last word, as if she herself had difficulty believing what she was reporting. She said they have a stockpile, hidden somewhere. It's an experimental drug developed by the group itself. What group? Who are these people? Regina shook her head. She wouldn't give names. She said it would be too dangerous, but she pulled a paper from the file. She wrote the name of the medication and its composition. I thought Dr. Richards should see this. Ezekiel took the paper with trembling hands. The handwriting was irregular, probably due to Darlene's injuries, but still legible. There was a complicated name, followed by a list of chemical components that made no sense to him. At that moment, a scream came from the ICU. Ezekiel ran back, the paper crumpled in his hand. Dr. Richards was leaning over Mirella, his tense voice, giving orders to the team. The pressure is dropping, a nurse informed him. Saturation at 85%. She's not responding to the medications, another voice said. We need to try something different. Dr. Richards seemed torn between several impossible decisions. It was when Ezekiel approached, extending the crumpled paper. Doctor, he called, his voice urgent. I need you to see this. It's about the medication she might need. The doctor took the paper, his eyes running quickly over the information. His expression changed subtly, first surprise, then comprehension, and finally something close to horror. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice low and tense. Her biological mother. She says it's what Mirella needs, that it was what they used. My God, the doctor interrupted. That explains a lot. Her reactions, the atypical symptoms. He looked at Mirella, then at the paper again. This isn't just an experimental medication. It's a completely new compound. If what's written here is correct, can we get it? Ezekiel asked, clinging to any hope. Dr. Richards shook his head. Not officially. This kind of medication doesn't exist in the regular channels. It would need years of testing, approvals. We don't have years, Ezekiel exploded. She needs it now. The doctor looked around, making sure no one else could hear them. Mr. Marquette, I need to be very clear here. Whatever they did to Mirella before she was born was highly illegal. And this medication, if it exists, it's in the hands of people who wouldn't hesitate to experiment on a child still in the womb. Ezekiel felt the weight of those words. But is it her only chance? Dr. Richards looked again at Mirella, her monitors still showing worrying signs. Based on these components, yes. Her body was altered to respond specifically to this formula. Any other treatment would only be palliative. A new alarm sounded, making both of them turn quickly towards the crib. Mirella's saturation had dropped. Even further. We need to do something, the doctor said, already turning his attention back to the patient. And we need to do it fast. Ezekiel left the ICU like a man on a mission. He found Regina still in the room next door, organizing her papers. I need to talk to Darlene again, he said. Now. Regina seemed to hesitate. Mr. Marquette, she's not here anymore. What do you mean? She escaped, Regina replied, her voice low. About an hour ago. No one knows how she managed to get past the police officer, but... Ezekiel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His only link to the medication that could save Mirella had vanished. But before he could completely process that information, Teresa appeared at the door, breathless. Mr. Marquette, Dr. Richards is calling. It's urgent. He ran back to the ICU, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. What he found made his blood run cold. Mirella was completely pale, her lips with a bluish tinge that betrayed the lack of oxygen. She's going into shock, Dr. Richards informed him, his hands moving quickly between equipment and medications. If we don't do something... He didn't complete the sentence, but he didn't need to. At that moment, while watching his little warrior fight for her life, Ezekiel made a decision. No matter what he needed to do, no matter what risks he needed to take, he would find that medication. What he didn't know was that this decision would lead him down a path even more dangerous than he could imagine, and that time was running. Out faster than anyone suspected. The early morning hours dragged on in the hospital like an eternity. The doctors had managed to stabilize Mirella, but her condition remained extremely delicate. Ezekiel paced the hallway like a caged animal, his mind working frantically, trying to find a solution. Teresa watched him with concern as she organized the medications at the nurses' station. "You need to at least sit down for a little while," she insisted. "You've been on your feet for over 24 hours. But Ezekiel barely heard her. His thoughts were focused on Darlene and the mysterious medication that could save his daughter. Why? Had she run away now? And where would she have gone? It was then that Regina appeared again, her face showing that she brought more worrying news. "Mr. Marquette," she called softly. "They found something in the room where Darlene was." She held out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a hastily written note, with the same irregular handwriting as the previous paper. "Forgive me. I'll try to get the medicine. Don't trust anyone at the hospital." Ezekiel felt a chill run down his spine. Why would she write that? What does she know that she hasn't told us? Regina shook her head. "The police are investigating how she managed to escape. The police officer who was at the door was found, unconscious. He said someone attacked him from behind, but he didn't see who it was." A disturbing thought began to form in Ezekiel's mind. What if Darlene hadn't run away on her own accord? What if someone had taken her? His thoughts were interrupted by Dr. Richards, who approached with a grave expression. "Mr. Marquette, we need to talk, in private." They went to the doctor's office. Dr. Richards closed the door and the blinds before speaking. "I've been analyzing that formula that the biological mother gave us," he began, his voice low and tense, "and I discovered something disturbing." Ezekiel felt his heart race. "What did you discover?" "Some of the listed components are controlled substances used only in very specific research, the kind of thing that shouldn't be available outside of highly regulated laboratories." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "I made some calls, consulted colleagues, and one name started to appear, Dr. Oliver." "Who is he?" "He was a brilliant researcher working with drug development for rare diseases. But he was removed from the scientific community a few years ago when they discovered he was conducting unauthorized experiments." Dr. Richards lowered his voice even further. "Experiments with pregnant women." Ezekiel felt his stomach churn. "Do you think he's involved with what they did to Mirella?" "It's possible. The formula has his signature. It's the kind of work he did. The problem is that after he was expelled from the academic community, he disappeared. No one knows his current whereabouts." "But there must be a way to find him," Ezekiel exclaimed, his voice betraying his despair. Dr. Richards hesitated before continuing. "There are rumors. They say he continued his research clandestinely, funded by powerful people who didn't care about the methods as long as they had results." At that moment, a nurse knocked urgently on the door. "Dr. Richards, Mirella's saturation is dropping again." The two men rushed to the ICU. Mirella was agitated in the crib, her little face contorted in an expression of pain that broke the heart of anyone who saw her. "The fever is back," informed Teresa, who was already beside the crib. 104 degrees and rising." Dr. Richards immediately began to work, adjusting medications, checking monitors. But Ezekiel could see in his eyes that he was fighting a battle he couldn't win, not without the correct medication. It was then that a strange movement in the hallway caught his attention. A man he had never seen before was talking to one of the nurses, showing some kind of identification. There was something about his posture that seemed out of place. Regina, who had also noticed the movement, approached Ezekiel discreetly. "That man was here earlier," she whispered, "asking questions about Mirella and Darlene." Ezekiel felt all his protective instincts alert themselves. What kind of questions? He said he was from the health department, investigating a possible case of irregular medication, but... Something doesn't seem right. I've worked with the health department before, and they don't act like that. They don't show up in the middle of the night. They don't ask questions like that. Ezekiel watched the man walk away down the hallway, making notes in a small notebook. His behavior resembled more a private investigator than a public official. He turned his attention back to Mirella, who now seemed a little calmer, although her vital signs continued to be unstable. Dr. Richards had managed to control the crisis momentarily, but for how long? It was then that Teresa approached, her face pale with concern. "Mr. Marquette," she called in a low voice. "I just discovered something strange. Someone's been messing with Mirella's chart. Pages have been removed. Annotations have been changed." Ezekiel felt a coldness in his spine. The words from Darlene's note echoed in his mind. "Don't trust anyone at the hospital." "When did this happen?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm not sure. I only noticed it now when I went to make the notes from the last medication, but it must have been recent." Dr. Richards, who had approached and heard the conversation, paled visibly. "This is very serious. We need to—" But before he could complete the sentence, all the monitors began to beep simultaneously. Mirella was having another crisis, worse than all the previous ones. "She's going into collapse," shouted one of the nurses. Chaos erupted in the ICU. The medical team ran from one side to the other, trying to stabilize Mirella. Ezekiel watched everything as if he were in a nightmare, his heart threatening to stop with each new alarm. It was then that his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from an unknown number. "I know where the medication is. Meet me in 1 hour at the corner coffee shop. Come alone. It's your daughter's only chance." Ezekiel looked at Mirella, then at the message again. He knew it could be a trap. He knew it was dangerous. But what choice did he have? "Dr. Richards," he called, his voice firm despite the fear he felt. "How much time does she have?" The doctor looked at the monitors, then at him. "Without the correct medication, maybe a few hours, at most a day." Ezekiel put the cell phone back in his pocket, his decision already made. No matter the risk, no matter the danger, he would find that medication, even if it was the last thing he did in his life. What he didn't know was that he was about to plunge into a world much darker and more dangerous than he could imagine, where nothing was what it seemed to be, and where each decision could mean the difference between life and death for his little Mirella. The corner coffee shop was a modest establishment, practically empty at that late hour. Ezekiel pushed open the glass door, the bell above it announcing his arrival with a soft chime. A sleepy waitress looked up from the counter, but soon turned her attention back to the magazine she was reading. His heart beat faster as he surveyed the surroundings. He had left Teresa with specific instructions not to leave Mirella's side for even a second, and Dr. Richards had promised to personally monitor anyone who tried to approach the medical chart. A lone woman was sitting at a table in the back, partially hidden by a column. Ezekiel immediately recognized the worn coat that Darlene was wearing at the hospital. He approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. "You came," she said without looking up. Her face was still marked by the bruises, but there was something different in her expression, a determination that wasn't there before. "Where's the medication?" he asked directly, remaining standing. Darlene finally looked at him. Her eyes were red and swollen, as if she'd been crying for hours. "It's not with me, but I know where we can get it." "Why did you run away from the hospital?" "Because they were coming," she replied, her voice low and urgent. "Dr. Oliver's men, they had already infiltrated the hospital staff. I needed to get out before they found me." Ezekiel sat down slowly, processing the information. The man who was asking questions. "One of them," Darlene confirmed. "There are others. They're everywhere, watching. They wanted to make sure Mirella wouldn't survive." "Why? What kind of experiment was this?" Darlene looked around nervously before continuing. "Dr. Oliver was developing a new kind of medicine, something revolutionary to treat rare genetic diseases, but he needed human guinea pigs. Desperate pregnant women willing to participate in experiments in exchange for money. Ezekiel felt his stomach churn. And you? I owed a lot of money to dangerous people, she interrupted, her voice choked up. They were going to kill me. When Dr. Oliver offered a way out, it seemed like the only option. She wiped a tear with the back of her hand. He promised it would be safe, that the baby wouldn't be at risk. But it was all a lie. What really happened? The medication. It did something to her still in the womb. It altered her DNA somehow. When I found out the truth, I tried to run, but she trembled visibly. They found me. They said the baby needed to die, that it was the only way to keep the experiment secret. Ezekiel felt a wave of nausea. So you abandoned her on the tracks? No, exclaimed Darlene, her eyes filling with tears again. I left her at the hospital. I thought she would be safe there, but they stole her. They wanted to force an accident. I followed. I managed to get her back. The tracks. It was the only thing I could think of. I knew the trains passed at fixed times. I prayed that someone would find her in time. A waitress approached to take orders, but Ezekiel dismissed her with a gesture. Where's the medication? Now? At Dr. Oliver's lab. It's a hidden place on the outskirts of town. He keeps a stockpile to continue the experiments. Darlene lowered her voice even further. But it's dangerous. Very dangerous. I don't care about the danger, Ezekiel replied. Mirella is dying. I need that medication. You don't understand, Darlene insisted. It's not just going in and getting it. The place is protected. And even if we manage to get in, we need to know exactly which medication to take. Any mistake... She didn't complete the sentence, but its meaning was clear. You know the place? Darlene nodded slowly. I stayed there during my pregnancy. I know the routine, the entrances, the security schedules, but... Then you're going to help me, Ezekiel declared. It wasn't a question. They'll kill me if they catch me. She's your daughter. The words hung between them like an accusation. Darlene closed her eyes, more tears streaming down her bruised face. I know, she whispered. That's why I came to you. I can't let her die. Not again. At that moment, Ezekiel's phone vibrated. It was a message from Teresa. Come quick, Mirella has gotten worse. He stood up abruptly. We don't have much time. You're coming with me now. Where to? First to the hospital. I need to see Mirella. Then you're going to take me to this lab. Now? Asked Darlene, the fear evident in her voice. Now? My daughter doesn't have any more time. Darlene hesitated for a moment, then nodded and stood up. Together, they stepped out into the cold night, each carrying their own fears and guilts. At the hospital, they found an even more worrying scenario. Mirella was having difficulty breathing, even with oxygen support. Her skin had acquired a grayish tone that made Ezekiel's heart clench. Dr. Richards met them in the hallway. Where were you? He asked, his voice tense. Something strange happened while you were gone. That man, the one who said he was from the health department, tried to enter the ICU. When the security guards stopped him, he ran away, completed Darlene. The doctor looked at her in surprise. Yes. How do you know? Because he's not from the health department, she replied. He's one of Dr. Oliver's men. They're trying to get to Mirella. Dr. Richards paled visibly. What are you talking about? Who's Dr. Oliver? Before anyone could answer, Teresa appeared, running down the hallway. Dr. Richards, her pressure is dropping again. The three ran to the ICU. Mirella was agitated in the crib, her small body struggling to breathe. The monitors showed increasingly worrying numbers. How much time does she have? Asked Ezekiel, his voice trembling. Dr. Richards checked the vital signs, his face grave. Hours, at most until dawn. Ezekiel turned to Darlene, who watched the scene with tears in her eyes. "It's now or never. Let's go get that medication." "Mr. Marquette," Dr. Richards intervened. "What are you talking about? What medication?" "The only one that can save her," replied Darlene. "The same one they used in the experiments." The doctor's eyes widened, understanding the gravity of the situation. "This is madness. It's too dangerous." "More dangerous is letting her die," Ezekiel replied. He turned to Teresa. "Stay with her. Don't let anyone approach." "But," began the nurse. "No one," he repeated firmly, "especially if they say they're from the health department or any other official agency." Teresa nodded, determined. "You can count on it. No one will get near her." Ezekiel gave a last look at Mirella, his heart breaking to see her so fragile. "Hold on, my love. Daddy will be right back." He left the ICU with Darlene on his heels, knowing that the next few hours would determine not only Mirella's fate, but also his own. What he didn't know was that the night held even darker surprises than he could imagine. The night was exceptionally cold when Ezekiel and Darlene left the hospital. His car, a discreet black sedan, was parked in the back of the building. During the drive, Darlene gave instructions in a low voice, as if she feared someone could hear her even inside the closed vehicle. "It's an old abandoned factory," she explained, her fingers drumming nervously in her lap. "It's about 40 minutes from here, near the industrial area. From the outside it looks abandoned, but inside—" She shuddered visibly. "Inside it's a nightmare." Ezekiel kept his eyes fixed on the dark road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Every minute away from Mirella was torture, but he knew this was the only chance to save her. "How are we going to get in?" he asked when they left the city behind. "There's an entrance in the back," Darlene replied. "It's used for deliveries. At this time of night, security is lower. I have the access code, at least what it was when I was there." She hesitated. "If they haven't changed it." The rest of the journey was made in tense silence. Ezekiel couldn't help but notice how Darlene became increasingly agitated as they approached their destination. Her eyes constantly darted to the rearview mirror as if expecting to see someone following them. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Darlene pointed to a dark building in the distance. "It's there. Stop here. We can't get too close with the car." Ezekiel parked in a dark area, shielded by trees. The industrial complex loomed ahead of them like an abandoned fortress. Most of the windows were broken or boarded up, and a high fence with barbed wire surrounded the entire perimeter. "Are there cameras?" he whispered, observing the area. "Several," Darlene replied, "but I know the blind spots. We'll have to be very careful." They moved in the darkness, staying in the shadows. Darlene guided them along a winding path through unkempt bushes until they reached a part of the fence partially covered by vegetation. "Here," she indicated, pushing aside some branches. "There's an opening. I used it when I wanted to sneak out during my pregnancy." The passage was tight, but they managed to squeeze through it. The inner courtyard was dark and silent, except for the occasional noise of operating equipment coming from inside the building. "The laboratory is in the basement," Darlene explained as they moved cautiously between abandoned containers. "That's where they keep the medications, but we need to go through the main area first." They approached a side door, apparently locked. Darlene typed a sequence of numbers on a partially hidden keypad. For an agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then with a soft click, the door opened. The interior was surprisingly clean and well maintained, contrasting sharply with the external appearance. White, well-lit corridors stretched in several directions. The smell of antiseptic in the air reminded him of a hospital. "This way," Darlene whispered, guiding him down a corridor. "To the left. The elevator to the basement is at the end of this corridor." She had barely finished speaking when they heard voices approaching. Darlene grabbed Ezekiel's arm, pulling him into a side room. They pressed themselves against the wall, barely, daring to breathe, while two men in white coats passed by, talking outside. "Dr. Oliver wants the results by tomorrow," said one of them. "He's not at all happy with what happened at the hospital." "That woman is a problem," replied the other. "We should have gotten rid of her when we had the chance." The voices faded as they moved away. Ezekiel felt Darlene tremble beside him. "They're talking about you," he whispered. She nodded, her face pale with fear. "Let's go. The elevator is right there." The elevator was small and old, more like an industrial freight elevator. They descended in tense silence to the basement. When the doors opened, they were greeted by a narrower, dimly lit corridor. "The stockpile is at the end," Darlene explained. "In a refrigerated room. But, she hesitated. "There's always someone on duty." As if to confirm her words, they heard movement coming from the indicated direction. A light came on at the end of the corridor. "Crap," Darlene murmured. "The guard is making his rounds." They hid in a dark alcove, watching a uniformed man slowly pass by, checking each door. When he turned into a side corridor, they moved quickly. Towards the stockroom, the door had another numerical keypad. "I don't know this code," admitted Darlene, biting her lip nervously. Ezekiel examined the keypad. "There must be another way." It was then they heard a metallic noise coming from the elevator. Someone was coming down. "Quick!" Darlene whispered, pulling him behind a large filing cabinet. The elevator doors opened and firm steps echoed through the corridor. A deep, authoritative voice cut through the silence. "I know you're here, Darlene. I can smell your fear." Darlene grabbed Ezekiel's arm so tightly that her nails left marks. Her entire body was trembling. "Dr. Oliver," she whispered, so low that Ezekiel could barely hear her. The steps approached slowly, methodically. "You were always so predictable," continued the voice. "I knew you'd come back. What I didn't expect was that you'd bring company." Ezekiel felt his heart race. How did he know? "There's no need to hide," continued Dr. Oliver. "I know exactly why you're here. The medication for little Mirella isn't... She can't have much time left now." Ezekiel's blood ran cold. How did he know her name? "I can help," said the voice, now closer. "I have what you need, but it has to be my way." Darlene let out a muffled sob. Ezekiel could feel her body, trembling violently beside him. "Last chance, Darlene. You know the consequences of defying me." The silence that followed was deafening. Ezekiel could hear his own heart beating in his ears. Mirella's life depended on the next decisions they made. It was then that his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Teresa. "Come quick. Mirella is very bad." At that moment, Ezekiel knew he had no choice. Slowly, he began to stand up. "No," Darlene whispered, grabbing his arm. "He'll kill us." "My daughter will die if I don't do something," he replied, his voice firm despite the fear. He stepped out from behind the filing cabinet, facing the man in the corridor. Dr. Oliver was tall and thin, with perfectly combed grey hair. His white coat was impeccable, and a cold smile played on his lips. "Ah, Mr. Marquette," he said, as if he was receiving a guest for tea. "Finally, we meet." What happened next would forever change the course of that night, and the lives of everyone involved. The dimly lit corridor seemed even darker with Dr. Oliver's presence. His smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and calculating as he studied Ezekiel. "You know," he began, adjusting the cuffs of his coat with precise and methodical gestures, "I've always been fascinated by how paternal love can make intelligent people make such reckless decisions." Ezekiel stood firm, although his heart was beating wildly. "Where's the medication?" "Straight to the point," Dr. Oliver laughed softly. "I like that. But first, we need to establish some rules." He took a step forward. "Darlene, dear, you can come out of there too. There's no need to hide." Darlene emerged slowly from behind the filing cabinet, her face pale with fear. Dr. Oliver watched her with an expression that mixed disappointment and irritation. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, you know," he said. "All that drama at the hospital, totally unnecessary. If you had followed the original plan, none of this would be happening." "The original plan was to kill my daughter," exploded Darlene, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "No, dear. The original plan was to advance science. Your daughter was just an inevitable side effect." Ezekiel felt a wave of nausea. "Enough games. My daughter is dying. What do you want in exchange for the medication?" Dr. Oliver smiled again, but there was something predatory in his expression. "It's simple, really. I want you both to sign a confidentiality agreement. Nothing you've seen here can come to the public. And I need little Mirella to remain available for observation." "Observation," repeated Ezekiel, feeling his blood run cold. "Scientifically speaking, your daughter is a unique specimen," explained Dr. Oliver, his tone clinical and dispassionate. "The only baby who survived the experimental treatment. We need to understand why, how her body adapted. The data is invaluable." "She's not an experiment," protested Ezekiel. "She's a child." "She's both," replied Dr. Oliver calmly. "And now you have a choice to make. Either you accept my conditions and save her life, or—" He left the sentence in the air, its meaning crystal clear. At that moment, Ezekiel's phone vibrated again. Another message from Teresa. "Saturation dropping. Dr. Richards says she won't last much longer." Despair threatened to consume him. He was about to respond when Darlene stepped forward. "There's another option," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "We can expose everything. I have proof. I kept documents, photos, records of the experiments." Dr. Oliver's expression changed subtly. "You're bluffing." "I'm not. Why do you think they never killed me? I left everything in a safe place. If anything happens to me or to Mirella, everything will go public." Ezekiel watched the change in the doctor's posture. For the first time, there was a shadow of concern in his eyes. "Where are these documents?" he asked, his voice losing some of its previous confidence. "In a safe place," repeated Darlene, "and I'll keep them there as long as you give us the medication. No conditions, no confidentiality agreements, no continued observation." Dr. Oliver was silent for a moment, clearly assessing his options. It was then that another sound echoed through the corridor, steps approaching. "Dr. Oliver?" called a male voice. "Is everything all right? The security system detected movement in the basement." "Everything is under control," he replied, without taking his eyes off Darlene. "Make the normal rounds." The steps faded away. Dr. Oliver sighed, as if making a difficult decision. "You know this doesn't end here," he said finally. "Powerful people are involved in this research. People who won't be happy to know they were blackmailed." "I don't care," replied Darlene. "I just want to save my daughter." Dr. Oliver studied her for a long moment before turning and typing a code on the stockroom door panel. The door opened with a soft click. "The medication is in refrigerator 3, top shelf," he said. "Take only what you need for immediate treatment. And remember, this isn't over." Ezekiel ran into the stockroom. Quickly locating the indicated refrigerator, he found several vials identified with codes. "Which one is the right one?" Darlene approached, examining the labels. "This one," she said, picking up a vial with amber liquid. "I'm sure it was what they used in the experiments." Dr. Oliver watched everything from the door, his face a mask of forced calm. "You'll need 3 doses, one every 12 hours. After that we'll see." Ezekiel put the vials carefully into his coat pocket. His phone vibrated once more, another message from Teresa. He didn't need to read it to know that time was running out. "Let's go," he said to Darlene, already moving towards the elevator. "One moment," called Dr. Oliver. "Darlene stays." "What?" exclaimed Ezekiel, turning quickly. "She's my guarantee," explained the doctor. "As long as she's here, I know those documents won't go public. And you," he smiled coldly, "you'll go back to your daughter and do what it takes to save her. Everyone wins." "No," protested Ezekiel. "I can't leave her." "Go," interrupted Darlene. "Mirella needs you. She needs the medication. I'll be okay." There was something in her voice, a determination that Ezekiel didn't completely understand. His eyes met hers, and in that brief moment, a silent message seemed to pass between them. "We're wasting precious time," said Dr. Oliver. "Your daughter awaits, Mr. Marquette." With a heavy heart, Ezekiel entered the elevator. The last image he had was of Darlene, standing next to Dr. Oliver, her face a mask of calm that didn't match the fear in her eyes. As the elevator went up, Ezekiel couldn't imagine that Darlene had one last act of redemption planned, one that would change everything, but would cost her the highest price possible. The night was not over yet, and more surprises awaited everyone involved in that dark plot of secrets and sacrifices. Ezekiel drove through the night like a man possessed, the precious medication safe in his pocket. His thoughts were divided between Mirella, fighting for her life in the hospital, and Darlene, who had been left behind in the hands of Dr. Oliver. Guilt consumed him, but he knew he had no choice. His priority had to be saving his daughter. The cell phone rang, breaking the tense silence of the car. It was Teresa. "Mr. Marquette," her voice was trembling, "please tell me you're coming back. Her saturation has dropped to 75%. Dr. Richards is already talking about intubation." "I'm on my way," he replied, pressing the accelerator even harder. 15 minutes, wait for me." As he drove, he couldn't help but think about Darlene's last words, that meaningful look they exchanged. There was something there, something he couldn't quite decipher. He arrived at the hospital in record time. He ran through the corridors, barely noticing the surprised looks of the night shift staff. In the ICU, he found a scene that froze his blood. Mirella was connected to even more machines, her small form almost disappearing between tubes and wires. "Thank God!" exclaimed Teresa upon seeing him. Dr. Richards approached quickly. "Did you get it?" asked the doctor, his voice tense with worry. Ezekiel took the vials out of his pocket carefully. 3 doses, 1 every 12 hours. Dr. Richards took one of the vials, examining it closely. "This is extraordinary," he murmured. "I've never seen anything like it. The composition, the color. Are you sure it's safe?" "It's her only chance," Ezekiel replied. "Darlene guaranteed it's the right medication." "Where is she?" asked Teresa, noticing the woman's absence. Ezekiel felt his throat tighten. She stayed behind, to give us time." Before anyone could ask more questions, Mirella's monitors began to beep frantically. "The saturation is dropping more," alerted a nurse. 72, 70. "We have no choice," decided Dr. Richards, already preparing the medication. "We'll have to risk it." The next few minutes were of absolute tension. Ezekiel watched, his heart almost stopping, as the doctor administered the first dose of the medication through Mirella's IV line. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the numbers on the monitors began to change. "The saturation is rising," announced Teresa, her voice barely containing emotion. 75, 80, 85. Dr. Richards checked the vital signs constantly, his expression changing from worry to amazement. "It's incredible. Her parameters are normalizing. Quickly. I've never seen anything like this." Ezekiel approached the crib, observing his little warrior. The color was beginning to return to her little face, her breathing becoming visibly easier. It was then that his phone vibrated again. An unknown number. His heart leaped as he answered. "Mr. Marquette?" Oh, the voice on the other side was of a young man, probably one of the security guards from the laboratory. Something happened. The woman who was with Dr. Oliver, Ezekiel felt his blood run cold. "What happened?" "She attacked him," replied the security guard, his voice agitated. "She managed to get the key to his computer. She accessed something. She's trying to send files." A noise of confusion on the other side of the line, distant screams, then Darlene's voice, clear and determined. "It's done. I sent everything. It's over, Oliver." Sounds of struggle, a sharp scream, then silence. "Hello?" called Ezekiel, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hello?" The line went dead. He tried to call back immediately, but only got a message that the number didn't exist. "Mr. Marquette," called Teresa softly, "is everything all right?" He turned to the nurse, realizing that he must be pale as a ghost. "No, I don't know. Darlene, I think she did something to expose everything." As if to confirm his words, his phone began to receive a flood of notifications, emails, dozens of them, hundreds, files, photos, documents, records of Dr. Oliver's experiments, all meticulously catalogued and organized, and not just for him, for journalists, authorities, regulatory agencies. "My God," he murmured, quickly scrolling through the files. "She planned this the whole time." Dr. Richards, who was observing Mirella, called his attention. "Look!" The little one had opened her eyes. For the first time in days, her gaze was clear, focused. She blinked a few times as if adjusting to the light, and then smiled. It was a small, weak, but real smile. The first since she had been found on the train tracks. Ezekiel felt the tears streaming down his face. He approached the crib, gently touching his daughter's little hand. She squeezed his finger with surprising strength. "She's going to be okay," said Dr. Richards, his voice choked with emotion. "The medication, it's as if it was made especially for her." "It was made," Ezekiel replied softly, "and it cost a lot." His phone continued to vibrate with new notifications. The scandal was spreading rapidly. The first headlines were already beginning to appear on news websites. Illegal experiments. On pregnant women, whistleblower reveals criminal scheme. Renowned doctor accused of using babies as guinea pigs. Documents reveal network of clandestine research. Teresa, who read the headlines over his shoulder, whispered, "She knew she wouldn't get out of there alive, didn't she? That's why she made sure the truth came out." Ezekiel nodded, unable to speak. Darlene's sacrifice weighed on his heart like lead. She had given her life not only to save Mirella, but to ensure that no other mother, no other child, went through the same horror. Later that night, when Mirella finally slept a peaceful and restorative sleep, Ezekiel sat next to her crib, holding her small hand. The news continued to arrive. The police had raided the laboratory. Dr. Oliver was arrested. Others involved were being identified. And Darlene. Darlene had been found in the basement of the laboratory. She had not survived the injuries, but her expression, according to initial reports, was serene, as if she knew that in the end, she had done the right thing. "Your mother was a hero," whispered Ezekiel to Mirella, "and I'll make sure you always know that." The little one stirred in her sleep, unconsciously squeezing her father's finger. Outside, the sun began to rise, bringing with it the promise of a new day, a day in which the truth finally came to light, even at the highest possible price. But the story wasn't over yet. Ezekiel's biggest challenge was still to come, and he had no idea what fate still held for him and his little warrior. The weeks that followed Darlene's death were a whirlwind of emotions and events. While Mirella recovered almost miraculously in the hospital, the scandal of Dr. Oliver's illegal experiments dominated the headlines. Each day, new shocking revelations came to light. The files that Darlene had sent were much more extensive and detailed than anyone could imagine. They weren't just records of the experiments, they were years of meticulous documentation, including the names of investors, politicians, and businessmen involved in the scheme. Ezekiel spent his mornings at the hospital with Mirella, watching in wonder her recovery, and the afternoons dealing with investigators and prosecutors who wanted his testimony. The nights were dedicated to reading Darlene's files, trying to fully understand the extent of what had happened. She documented everything, he explained to Teresa on a particularly difficult afternoon. Every injection, every test, every suspicious conversation, as if she knew from the beginning that one day she would need to prove everything. Teresa, who had become much more than a nurse, she was practically part of the family now, looked at Mirella playing in her crib. The little one was unrecognizable compared to the fragile child of a few weeks ago. Maybe she did know, Teresa replied softly. Maybe that was her way of redeeming herself, ensuring that the truth came to light no matter the cost. The cost, as they discovered in the following days, went far beyond Darlene's life. Dr. Oliver's scheme was just the tip of the iceberg. His research was funded by a complex network of businessmen and politicians who would profit from the development of experimental drugs. "Mr. Marquette," called Dr. Richards, entering the ICU with a worried expression. "We need to talk about something important." Ezekiel followed the doctor to his office, his heart clenching with apprehension. But Dr. Richards had a small smile on his face. "Mirella's latest tests have arrived," he began, spreading papers on his desk, "and the results are, well, extraordinary." "How so?" "The medication not only treated the symptoms, it seems to have completely corrected the genetic changes caused by the experiments. It's as if her body has been reprogrammed." Ezekiel felt a chill run down his spine. "That's good, isn't it?" "It's more than good," replied the doctor, adjusting his glasses. "It's revolutionary. What Dr. Oliver did was monstrous, unethical, and criminal, but he may have accidentally developed something that could help thousands of children with similar genetic conditions." The implication of those words weighed on Ezekiel. "The other vials of the medication are in police custody," completed Dr. Richards, "along with all the formulas and research records. Eventually, after everything is properly investigated, they can be used to develop a legitimate treatment." At that moment, Teresa rushed into the room. "Dr. Richards, Mr. Marquette, come quick." They ran back to the ICU, fearing the worst. But what they found was something completely different. Mirella was sitting in the crib, laughing and clapping her hands. "She's never done that before," said Teresa, tears of joy in her eyes. "It's like she's finally free." Ezekiel approached the crib, his heart overflowing with emotion. Mirella raised her little arms to him, asking to be held, another gesture she had never made before. He picked her up carefully, feeling her warm and healthy body against his chest. She rested her head on his shoulder, letting out a contented sigh. "Papa," she murmured softly. The world seemed to stop. Ezekiel looked at Teresa and Dr. Richards, who looked as shocked as he was. "She spoke," exclaimed Teresa. "Her first word." Ezekiel hugged Mirella tighter, tears streaming down his face. At that moment, all the horror of the past few weeks, all the pain and fear seemed a little less heavy. Later that night, after Mirella fell asleep, Ezekiel found something interesting among Darlene's files, a personal diary written during her pregnancy. The last pages were especially touching. "Dear daughter," she wrote, "I know I'll never be able to undo the harm I allowed them to do to you, but I promise I'll fix this no matter the cost. One day you'll understand that sometimes we need to lose everything to save those we love. I just hope that wherever you are, you find someone who loves you as much as I should have loved you from the beginning." Ezekiel closed the diary, his heart heavy. Darlene had fulfilled her promise in the most definitive way possible. The next morning, he received a call that would further change the course of events. It was from the detective in charge of the investigation. "Mr. Marquette," he said, his voice grave, "we found something in Dr. Oliver's lab. Something I think you need to see." "What is it?" "It's better if we talk in person. It has to do with Ms. Darlene and with your deceased wife." Ezekiel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. "My wife? What does she have to do with this?" "Please, come to the police station as soon as you can. There are things you need to know." He hung up the phone with trembling hands. What else did this story hold? What other dark secrets were about to come to light? He looked at Mirella, sleeping peacefully in her crib. She had overcome so much, fought so bravely. But were the battles really over? Teresa, noticing his agitation, approached. "Is everything all right?" "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but I'm going to find out. Can you stay with her for a few hours?" "Of course," replied Teresa. "Go do what you need to do. We'll be here waiting." Ezekiel kissed Mirella's forehead softly before leaving. Something told him that the revelations that awaited him at the police station would change everything again. What he didn't know was that the truth he was about to discover was even more shocking than he could imagine. A truth that connected not only Darlene and his deceased wife, but also Dr. Oliver himself in a web of events that began long before Mirella's birth. The police station was bustling that morning, filled with investigators and prosecutors working on Dr. Oliver's case. Ezekiel was led to a room at the back of the building where Detective Roberto Silva was waiting for him. The policeman had a grave expression and held a thick file on the table. "Mr. Marquette," he greeted, indicating a chair. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Ezekiel sat down, his heart racing. "What did you discover about my wife?" The detective opened the file carefully, removing some old photographs. "Do you recognize this woman?" Ezekiel took the photo with trembling hands. It was Maria Helena, his wife, younger than he remembered, in front of a building he didn't recognize. Next to her was... He caught his breath. "Dr. Oliver," he murmured, recognizing the younger version of the doctor. "Exactly," confirmed the detective. "This photo was taken approximately 16 years ago at the old research center where Dr. Oliver worked before being expelled from the scientific community." "I don't understand," said Ezekiel, his mind spinning. "Maria Helena was a biology professor. What would she be doing there?" The detective removed more documents from the file. "Your wife wasn't just a professor, Mr. Marquette. She was a brilliant researcher. She worked on a secret project with Dr. Oliver developing treatments for rare genetic diseases." Ezekiel felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "Impossible. She would have told me." "The project was highly confidential," continued the detective, "but Maria Helena discovered something that disturbed her deeply." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "We found her research diary in Dr. Oliver's lab." With trembling hands, the detective handed a worn notebook to Ezekiel. The handwriting was unmistakably Maria Helena's. The last notes were dated a few days before her death. "Dr. Oliver's experiments are unethical," one passage read. "He's using pregnant women without their knowledge or real consent. What he does to those women, to those babies, is monstrous. I need to expose this, no matter the cost." Ezekiel felt his stomach churn. "Are you saying that—" "The robbery that killed your wife," interrupted the detective softly. "It wasn't a common robbery. We found evidence that it was planned. Maria Helena was 6 months pregnant at the time, wasn't she?" Ezekiel nodded, unable to speak. The pain of that loss, even after 15 years, was still too acute. Dr. Oliver couldn't allow her to expose his experiments, continued the detective. But there was more. The baby she was carrying would be the firstborn to a mother who fully knew the procedure, a researcher who understood the process and had helped develop it. "My God," murmured Ezekiel, the realization hitting him like a punch. "He killed her. He killed my wife and my child. And he continued his experiments for years," completed the detective, until Mirella. Ezekiel flipped through more pages of the diary, his eyes catching excerpts that broke his heart, plans to expose the scheme, concerns about other pregnant women, notes on the development of her own baby. "But there's more," said the detective, his voice even more serious. "Darlene didn't choose you by chance, Mr. Marquette." "What do you mean?" The detective picked up another document. "We found this among her things. It's an old news article about Maria Helena's death. Darlene knew who you were. She knew your story." "Why? Why didn't she tell me?" "Because she knew she needed you," replied the detective. "She needed someone who understood the monstrosity of Dr. Oliver's experiments, someone who had a personal reason to fight." Ezekiel felt warm tears streaming down his face. "So that day, on the tracks, it wasn't a coincidence. Darlene knew your schedules. She knew you'd be in that office. She planned everything, not to get rid of Mirella, but to put her in your hands, the only hands that could truly protect her." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with 15 years of pain and secrets. Ezekiel looked again at the photo of Maria Helena, her smile frozen in time, unaware that she was living her last days. "There's one more thing," said the detective hesitantly. "Something we found in the lab. A file with the name Project Mirella." Ezekiel raised his eyes, surprised. "How?" "It was the name Maria Helena had chosen for her daughter," explained the detective. "If it was a girl, Darlene must have found that out too. That's why she gave the same name to her own daughter. It was too much." Ezekiel felt the weight of all those revelations crushing his chest. His wife, his unborn child, Darlene Mirella, all the pieces fitting into a cruel and painful puzzle. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Dr. Oliver will be indicted for multiple homicides, in addition to the crimes related to the illegal experiments," replied the detective. "But there's something more urgent, something we need to discuss about Mirella's safety." Ezekiel felt his heart clench. "What kind of threat?" "There are still powerful people involved in this story," explained the detective. "People who don't want any more details to come to light. And Mirella, well, she's living proof of it all." The fear that Ezekiel felt at that moment was different from anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the acute fear of immediate loss, as when he found her on the tracks, or when she was fighting for her life in the hospital. It was a deep, persistent fear, the fear that the story hadn't really ended. "Yet, what do you suggest?" he asked, trying to keep his voice firm. The detective picked up another envelope. "We have a plan, but I need you to trust us completely. It's the only way to ensure that Mirella is truly safe." As the detective explained the details of the plan, Ezekiel felt his world spin again. Once again, he would have to make impossible decisions to protect his daughter. Once again, he would have to find strengths he didn't know he possessed. What he didn't imagine was that the true test of his strength was still to come, and that the price of Mirella's safety would be even higher than anyone could foresee. The return to the hospital that afternoon was one of the most difficult experiences of Ezekiel's life. Every step through the familiar corridors seemed heavy, burdened with the knowledge of the revelations he had just received. When he arrived at the pediatric ICU, he found Mirella awake, playing happily with Teresa. "Papa!" exclaimed the little one upon seeing him, reaching out her arms towards him. The sound of that word, which a few days ago would have filled him with joy, now made his heart clench. How could he protect her from what was to come? Teresa immediately realized that something was wrong. Mr. Marquette, what happened? He picked Mirella up in his arms, hugging her tight against his chest, as if he could protect her from the world with just that gesture. We need to talk, Teresa, in private. Dr. Richards joined them in his office, closing the door to ensure privacy. Ezekiel then shared everything he had discovered. Maria Helena's connection with Dr. Oliver, the real reason for her death, Darlene's plan, and finally, the threat that still loomed over them. "My God," murmured Teresa, tears streaming down her face. "So none of this was a coincidence?" "No," replied Ezekiel, his voice tired. "Darlene chose every detail. She knew I'd be the only one who could really protect Mirella because..." His voice faltered. "Because I had already lost everything once, because of Dr. Oliver." Dr. Richards, who had listened to everything in silence, finally spoke. "What's the police's plan?" Ezekiel took a deep breath before answering. "They want us to disappear, me and Mirella, a special protection program, far from here, with new identities." "For how long?" asked Teresa, her voice trembling. "Indefinitely. Until everyone involved is arrested, until there's no more threat." He paused, looking at Mirella, who had fallen asleep in his arms. "It could be years." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with implications. Teresa was the first to break it. "When?" "Tonight," replied Ezekiel. "A car will pick us. Up at midnight. The fewer people who know, the safer it will be." Dr. Richards adjusted his glasses, a gesture that Ezekiel already knew as a sign of concern. "What about her treatment, the medication?" "The police seized all the stock from the lab. They'll make sure we have enough." Ezekiel hesitated. "But we need your help, Doctor. I need you to prepare all her medical documentation." "But in a way, that can't be traced." The doctor nodded gravely. "I'll take care of that personally. What about future tests? The follow-up?" "We'll have medical support at the new location," Ezekiel explained, "but no one can know the whole story. To the world, we'll just be an ordinary father and daughter, moving to a new city for personal reasons." Teresa sobbed softly. "We won't be able to say goodbye properly, will we?" Ezekiel felt his heart clench even tighter. Teresa had become a fundamental part of their lives in recent weeks. Seeing her pain was almost unbearable. "It's better this way," he said gently, "safer for everyone." The next few hours were a blur of silent preparations. Dr. Richards worked tirelessly on the medical documentation, while Teresa discreetly organized a small suitcase with the essentials for Mirella. Around 11 p.m., when the hospital was quieter, Detective Roberto Silva appeared personally for the final arrangements. He brought with him a folder with new documents, birth certificates, IDs, passports, all meticulously prepared. "From now on, you are Alexander and Maria Clara Santos," he explained in a low voice. "Memorize every detail of the new identities. The cover story is simple. You are a widower who decided to start a new life in another city with your adopted daughter." Ezekiel leafed through the documents mechanically, trying to absorb his new reality. "Where are we going?" "For safety, you'll only know when you're in the car. The driver has the instructions." The detective paused. "Are you sure you don't want to say goodbye? To anyone? Family? Friends?" Ezekiel shook his head. He had no close family left, and his few friends, well, it was better that they didn't know anything. The fewer people who know, the better. When it was 15 minutes to midnight, Teresa entered the room one last time. Her eyes were red and swollen, but she maintained her professional composure. "Everything is ready," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The suitcase is in the car and—" She hesitated, then took something out of her uniform pocket. "I made this for her." It was a small photo album with pictures of Mirella in the hospital. Her first smiles, the moment she started to recover, small, precious moments from recent weeks. "So she never forgets where she came from," explained Teresa, tears streaming silently down her face. "So she knows she was loved from the first moment." Ezekiel hugged Teresa for a long time, words being insufficient to express his gratitude. Dr. Richards joined them for a last goodbye, his normally controlled face also marked by emotion. "Take care of yourselves," he said simply, shaking Ezekiel's hand. Exactly at midnight, a dark, discreet car stopped at the back of the hospital. Ezekiel, carrying the sleeping Mirella, followed Detective Silva through the silent corridors. Each step seemed to echo with the finality of the moment. When they reached the car, the detective issued one last warning. "Remember, from now on, Ezekiel Marquette no longer exists. Your only priority is to keep Mirella safe." Ezekiel settled his daughter in the back seat, carefully adjusting the seatbelt so as not to wake her up. Before getting into the car, he cast one last look at the hospital, at the window of the ICU, where Teresa and Dr. Richards watched his departure. The driver, a middle-aged man with an unfriendly face, didn't say a word as he started the engine. The car slid silently into the night, leaving behind not only a city, but a whole life. Mirella stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Ezekiel held her small hand, making a silent promise. No matter where they went, no matter how long it took, he would keep her safe. It was what he owed Maria Helena, to Darlene, and above all, to his little warrior. What he didn't know was that fate still had one last card to play, one that would change everything again in the most unexpected way possible. 6 months had passed since that night when Ezekiel, now Alexander, and Mirella, now Maria Clara, left their old lives behind. They settled in a small town in the countryside, where no one knew them and where they could start over without raising suspicion. The house they occupied was modest but welcoming, with a small garden where Mirella loved to play. Gradually, they were building a new routine. Ezekiel continued to manage his business remotely under his new identity, while dedicating most of his time to his daughter. Mirella flourished every day. The medication continued to take effect, and she developed like any normal child her age. Her smiles lit up the house. Her laughter filled the rooms with joy. For all intents and purposes, they were just a dedicated father and his adorable little daughter. On a particularly sunny Saturday morning, while watching Mirella playing in the garden, Ezekiel received a call from Detective Silva, the first in months. "We need to talk," said the detective, his voice tense. "Something happened." Ezekiel's heart raced instantly. "Something bad?" "Not exactly. Dr. Oliver died in prison last night." Ezekiel felt a chill run down his spine. "How?" "Natural causes, apparently. But before he died, he left a full confession and a letter addressed to you." The world seemed to spin for a moment. "A letter?" "Yes, and there's more. The documents Darlene sent, they led to more discoveries than we imagined. The network of people involved is being completely dismantled. Politicians are being arrested, businessmen are being indicted." Ezekiel watched Mirella picking flowers in the garden, oblivious to the conversation that would change their lives once again. "What does this mean for us?" "It means," replied the detective after a pause, "that maybe you can come back. If you want to, of course. The threat is practically neutralized." The news hit Ezekiel like a wave. Go back, resume their lives. Was it possible? "The letter," continued the detective. "You need to read it. It explains a lot. About Maria Helena, about the experiments, about everything." 2 hours later, a discreet messenger delivered a sealed envelope. Ezekiel waited until Mirella was taking her afternoon nap to open it. The handwriting was small and precise, characteristic of Dr. Oliver. "Dear Ezekiel, by the time you read this letter, I will be dead. It is fitting, I suppose. So many lives were lost because of me. It is only fair that mine also comes to an end. But before that, you deserve to know the whole truth about Maria Helena, about the experiments, about the real reason for all of this. Your wife was brilliant, more brilliant than me, to be honest. She understood things about genetics that would take me years to comprehend. The project we were working on was her idea originally, a way to correct genetic defects even during gestation, but she wanted to do everything through official channels, tests, approvals, protocols. I didn't have that patience. I saw children dying every day from diseases we could cure, or at least that's what I told myself to justify my actions. When Maria Helena discovered that I was testing the treatment on pregnant women without authorization, she was horrified. She threatened to denounce me. I panicked. There were powerful people investing in the project, people who wouldn't accept a scandal. I didn't order her to be killed. I need you to know that. But when they told me what had happened, I did nothing to stop it. I convinced myself that it was necessary, that the end justified the means. I spent the following years perfecting the treatment, using desperate women like Darlene. Some lost their babies, others, well, you know what happened to them. But Mirella was different. She survived, she thrived. And do you know why? Because the treatment I used on her was based on Maria Helena's original research, the work she did during her own pregnancy. Your unborn daughter and Mirella share more than you imagine. The same treatment, the same fight for life. That's why Darlene chose you. She discovered all this in my files. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I hope this confession helps in some way. All the money I made from the research has been transferred to an account in Mirella's name. It's the least I can do to try to compensate for all the harm I caused. Use the money for the legitimate research that Maria Helena always wanted to do, to help other children the right way this time. With remorse, Dr. Oliver. Ezekiel let the letter fall on the table, his hands trembling. At that moment he heard Mirella calling from the room. She had woken up from her nap. When he entered the room, he found her sitting on the bed, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Papa!" she smiled, reaching out her arms. He picked her up, feeling her warm and healthy body against his chest. Through the window, the afternoon sun created a golden pattern on the floor of the room. "Do you want to go home?" he asked softly. Mirella looked at him, her eyes, so like Maria Helena's, shining with curiosity. "Home? Yes, little one, to our real home, where Teresa is and Dr. Richards." Her little face lit up at recognizing the names. "Teresa!" she exclaimed happily. Ezekiel smiled, silent tears streaming down his face. "Yes, we're going to see Teresa again." That night, after Mirella fell asleep, Ezekiel made 2 calls, one to Detective Silva, confirming that he agreed to return, and another, using a number he had memorized, to Teresa. Her reaction upon hearing his voice was exactly as he imagined, a mixture of crying and laughter, of relief and joy. "You're coming back? Is it safe?" "Yes," he replied. "We're coming home." A week later, Ezekiel and Mirella were back in the city where it all began. Teresa was waiting for them at the hospital, along with Dr. Richards. The reunion was emotional. Tears, hugs, promises to never separate again. Mirella ran into Teresa's arms as if they had never been apart. "I knew you'd come back, little warrior," whispered the nurse, hugging her tight. Dr. Richards, after examining Mirella completely, confirmed what everyone already knew. She was perfectly healthy, developing normally, without any sequelae from the experiments. The treatment worked, he said, amazed. And now, with Dr. Oliver's confession and all the documents, we can use this knowledge to help other children, the right way, as Maria Helena wanted. Ezekiel looked out the window of the hospital at the same train tracks where he had found Mirella so many months ago. Fate had woven a complex and painful plot, but in the end, something good had emerged from all the tragedy. Maria Helena's sacrifice had not been in vain. Darlene's love had saved not only her daughter, but opened the way to saving many other children in the future. And Mirella would have the life that both dreamed for her, a life of love, of safety, of possibilities. "Papa," she called, pulling his hand. "Let's go home." Ezekiel picked her up in his arms, his heart overflowing. "With love, yes, my little one, let's go home forever." And so, under the afternoon sun, father and daughter walked out of the hospital, leaving behind the shadows of the past and walking towards a future full of hope. A future built on the love, the sacrifice, and the courage of those who gave everything to protect one small, innocent life, a future that finally was all theirs.